Over these last weeks, we've been exploring the nature of emptiness. But you know, we've dubbed all of these stories and what comes out of these gatherings as giving it the designation of the divine play. But really, in another words, it could be described as a divine alchemy, because the stories are like ingredients that we put into the alchemical cauldron and stir them up. But as with all alchemy, and there has been a pattern of stories over these days, the alchemist will sometimes add a little tincture just to stir up the brew. So the story that's to be told is just to do that, to stir up the brew. But perhaps you'll remember that story about alchemy, which comes to mind, about that man who read and heard from certain pundits that if you studied alchemy, that you could become immortal. So he went out and he bought himself a cauldron, and he bought himself the books, and he started to study. He put the cauldron in his basement, and every day he would go down there and he'd study the books, and he'd put the ingredients that he'd gathered into his cauldron. He'd stir it around and stir it around. But you know, this man happened to have a bad-tempered shrew for a wife. And one day she came to the top of the stairs and she said, "Husband, you have to take care of the baby because our servant is away today and I have to go to market." So he dutifully went up the stairs and took the baby and put it on his hip, went about stirring his brew. But he got so involved in the stirring that all of a sudden the baby slipped into the cauldron. And when he fished it out, oh my God, pure gold. He looked at it as a wonder of wonders. I've finally done it. I've turned it into gold. And he thought, oh my God, what will my wife say? So as he was admiring this wonderful achievement, his dog happened to catch sight of the cat next door, and they started to run around the room, and all of a sudden the cat skidded across the room, fell into the cauldron too. Oh my God. And then the dog slipped up into the cauldron too. Fished them out. Pure gold. How marvelous. He lined them up, congratulating himself on his achievement of making pure gold. But what was he going to tell his wife? Anyway, of course, his wife comes back and she stands at the top of the stairs. She says, "Husband, I'm home, bring the baby up here." And he says, "Oh, wife, well, I have something to tell you." I don't want to listen to any of that, just bring the baby up here." And then she started to stamp her feet. She slipped on a bit of doggy-do on the top of the stairs, slid down the stairs, into the cauldron. Pure gold. So what was he to do? So he had to get a rope, and he tied it around the extended gold arms that were sticking out of the cauldron, and tried to heave her out, but she was so heavy, of course, he slipped into her. Well, the servant came back the next day and found all of these gold creatures. And what to do? They sent a message through one of the king's soldiers who happened to be passing by, who went back and told the king. And as it happened, the king was a very fair and honest man, so he had all of the gold pieces brought back to his palace, melted down, and made coins to give out to the poor. But this little tincture that goes into our pot in our endeavors to find that understanding or even tip us into the awareness of emptiness, so-called. There was an emir, and he was the son of a great general who had attained to becoming the monarch of this place through his hard endeavours on the battlefield, and he had been a very fair and just ruler. But of course his son had been brought up to wealth and adulation, and so this emir was very self-centered. And it seemed that he enclosed himself in this realm of opulence and self-indulgence and hedonistic behavior. He had 1,000 servants, white and black, and they all had to bow and scrape to him. He had advisors who were yes men, yes this, yes that, just buttering him and giving him praise even when it wasn't due. So his view of existence was totally distorted. He didn't care for his subjects at all. He never went out of his palace except to go hunting. He gathered jewels and great wealth around him. But then one night he went to sleep and he dreamt. He dreamt that he was standing in a place that he had never been before, but it was of such glory. It outdid even the greatest of his palaces. And there he was, standing in front of what could only be described as an angelic being who was writing in a book. And the angelic being looked up at him and said, "Why have you forgotten what it is to be a true king?" And somehow deep within himself, the emir had a sense of what it was that the angelic being was saying, but he immediately tried to, yes, but I've got all of these people who agree with me with what I say, and the angelic being warned the emir, beware, beware, unless you change your ways, fate will not be kind to you. So the next morning the emir woke, and of course he was in a rather agitated state after this dream. So to forget about it, put it out of his mind, he decided to go on a hunt. So he gathered all of his courtiers together, and in great pomp and ceremony he went out to go on a hunt with his cheetahs. Well, as it happened, the cheetah caught sight of a gazelle and went dashing off into the forest. And it was only the emir on his great black stallion who had a steed fast enough to be able to follow the cheetah into the forest. So they dashed off, leaving far behind the entourage of the emir. But as they went deeper and deeper into the forest, it seemed that a great wind started to blow. It got louder and louder and stronger, and it was whipping around the emir, whipping off his turban, whipping off his clothes. Finally he descended off his stallion, and it felt like there were 1,000,000 bees stinging his face and his body and tearing at his garments. His stallion took fright and dashed off in the distance, and he was left in a bedraggled, battered state. And it seemed that he fell into some kind of unconsciousness. But when he awoke, he looked up to find a man looking down at him, giving him water out of a goat skin. An nomad. And he said, what am I doing here? Where am I? And the nomad said, "We found you after the sandstorm." He said, I'm the emir. Take me to my palace. The nomad laughed. "You, the emir, look at you. Look, you've ragged clothes, you've had one shoe." And no matter what the emir said, he could not convince the nomad that he was the emir, the monarch. So the nomads, being kind people, they took him back to their camp. And he said, "Take me back to my palace." And the nomad said, "We've never been to the monarch's palace. We couldn't even get close to this emir's palace." So the emir was left wandering with these nomads for a while, and they clad him and they fed him. And then when they came to a town, they left him there. And somehow he made his way back to his palace. And he went to the gates, and he shook the gates, and he said, "I'm the emir, let me in." And the guard said, "You demented, degraded fellow, how could you be the emir? Why, the emir at this moment is in prayer in the garden where he usually is every day. Look through the gate." So the emir looked through the gate, and there, sure enough, was someone clad in his robes, wearing his ruby ring of office, kneeling on his prayer mat in the garden in prayer. And when the emir looked, he saw that this being had a halo of light around him. Now, the emir, now reduced to beggarhood, could only go from mosque to mosque seeking alms. But then somehow he gathered his strength, and he was able to carry people's packages in the street. A woman who was carrying a heavy load. He used to sleep behind the ovens of the rich people to keep warm. And then one evening, the house outside which he was sleeping caught fire, and he was able to dash in and save several children that had been inside. But he quickly went away to hide so people wouldn't see him. But that night, he dreamt that he was again the emir. But in the morning, he woke up and he was back to being this ragged, beggared creature. The days passed, and every Friday, all the beggars of the town would go to the outside of the palace where the emir gave alms. This was new to the populace, and the populace now were looking on the emir in a different way, but of course it was not the emir. But when our emir went to the palace and he gazed at the face of that being who was taking his place, the emir, in giving the alms, looked at him and said, "Good man." Sometime not long afterwards, a runaway horse came dashing down the main street, knocking over people, stalls, peasants, and our emir dashed out because he knew horses. After all, he had his black stallion. He knew the way of horses. So he dashed out in front of the horse, and he was able, with comforting words, to stop the horse in its tracks. Oh, people came from everywhere to thank him. The cobbler gave him a new pair of shoes. Everyone gave him the thanks and adulation for his good deed. That day, when he was going back to find a place, an oven in which to curl up and sleep, was it a dream or was it real? Before him stood the emir, wearing his robes, wearing his ruby ring. And this being said to our emir, Now you have become a true king. Here are your robes and your ring of office. And in an instant that being was gone, and there in front of the emir was his robe and his ring. Putting them back on, he went over to the gates of the palace and said to the guard, I am the emir. Give me entry to my palace. And the guard, seeing him, opened the gates and allowed him in. From that time on, he ruled justly and wisely, because he knew the ways of life and people. This is the tincture that we add to our Alchemist's cauldron in our quest to understand, and in understanding to ourselves experience the nature of emptiness. Let it do its work in its own way, because this is the way of tinctures. When we add ingredients to our alchemist's pot, we have to stir them. We have to let them brew inside our being on those three levels of life. But a tincture is different. A tincture you place in the cauldron, and immediately it causes a chemical reaction. Isn't it so? No stirring required, merely a chemical reaction. So let's see what this story does for us when we add it to this brew that's already been stirred over these last weeks and days. Thank you.